Hello, so today we're going to have a look at our new topic, which is going back to ethics. We've just finished religious language, which is a philosophy topic, and now we're going on to meta-ethics, which is an ethics topic, but the two are actually quite closely linked because it's having a look at the meaning of the words that we're using. So what I thought would be a really good thing for you to start to do is try to describe the word yellow. Imagine somebody that's never seen the colour yellow before, that's maybe blind, for example. How would you describe the colour yellow to them? Just write a few sentences down and try and figure out if it's really difficult to do or if it's really easy to do. And I'd be really interested to find out how you found describing that word yellow. The next thing I thought would be really useful to do is to have a look at the syllabus. So what actually does AQA say that we have to learn and have to study when we're having a look at ethics and religion, but also having a look at meta-ethics specifically. So as you can see there in the specification section and the suggested content section, this is probably going to take about, maybe 7 or 8 different lessons, and I'm going to try and record every single one of these because although it's a fairly easy concept to get your head around, there's lots of little bits which we really need to be understanding, which we really need to be aware of. So even though on here they've said that it will take about 6 lessons, I think in reality, with the way that things are working at the moment with remote learning, it's going to take probably about 8 lessons to go through this. And today is just a simple introduction to meta-ethics and to some of those key terms. Nothing too heavy whatsoever, and it definitely shouldn't take you much longer than about 40 minutes to complete this section. But then we're going to start to have a look at things like divine command theory. So I know that we've had a look at this before, and I know that this is something that we've also touched on in the GCSE content. So this is something that's not too unfamiliar to yourselves. Then we're going to have a look at utilitarianism, which again I know I've touched on a little bit. So it might be a phrase or a word which you are familiar with, but you might not know a huge amount about it. And utilitarianism is the idea that we always have to try and act in a way which suits the most amount of people. Then we're going to have a look at intuitionism, and that intuitionism derives its root word from intuition. So you might have heard statements like woman's intuition, for example. And it's kind of that idea that we just know what's right or wrong. We don't need God to tell us what's right or wrong. We just kind of know it. We've got this inner sense and ability to understand the difference between right and wrong. And then we're going to have a look at the strengths and weaknesses of the idea. So I would really recommend having a look at this properly. And I would recommend going onto the AQA website, which is the code 7062. If you type that into Google, AQA 7062, it should come up straight away with the whole specification. That is something I'm hoping that you've all got saved, because at the very beginning of the Year 12 course, I said that specification is really key because it literally breaks down every single topic that we study into sections like this. So you can know what we're going to study, which means that you could potentially pre-read in all of that time that you are meant to be doing independent study. But it also acts as a bit of a kind of checklist, and you can rag it, so red, amber, green, for how confident you are on that element within a subject, within the entire course. So, first things first, I thought we'd just do a bit of a recap. As we know, because we started this at the very first few lessons that we ever did ethics, there are 4 different ways of doing ethics, and we look at 3 of them specifically. The third one, the descriptive approach, although we touch on it a little bit, it's not something that we really specifically, or the course specifically touches on. But we do normative ethics, and normative derives from the word standard or norm. So it's just kind of the normal approach to ethical decision making. And this has a look at patterns of behaviour and how we should behave in a morally correct way. And just again as a reminder, that's things like situation ethics, virtue ethics, and natural moral law, and whether or not these things are teleological or deontological. So that should be really cemented in your brains already. You should be really confident on the normative ethical approach. If you are not, I really suggest going back and refreshing yourselves on what those normative approaches are and the key scholars who are linked to those. Once we studied normative ethics, we then moved on to applying those normative ethics to a different set of moral standards. So we had a look at things like issues of human life and death, issues of non-human life and death, so things like animal testing, and we applied those 3 ethical approaches to lots of different ways. So things like abortion, euthanasia, the death penalty, animal testing, intensive farming, all of those different things we've applied the normative standard behaviour way of ethics to. The descriptive approach, like I said, although we've touched on perhaps when we had a look at things like the death penalty and how America views the death penalty in comparison to England, but it's not something that we really touch on in part of the course, which is why I've put all of that section in red, because it's not something that we really need to be having a look at, although I've drip fed you little bits of information as we've gone through the course. And then finally, we've got meta-ethics. Now, I said earlier on, meta-ethics links quite closely to religious language, which is why it's a natural progression to move from religious language into meta-ethics, because it's having a look at the meaning of the language that we are using when we say something is good, right, bad, wrong, etc., etc. It's about justifying those words. And the word meta means above or beyond in Greek. So in other words, meta-ethics is looking beyond the ethical theories. It's looking above the ethical theories. It's looking deeper into the ethical theories and really trying to work out what we mean when we say an action is good or morally right, or what do we mean when we say something is bad. So those are the 4 ways of doing ethics, and you should be particularly familiar with number 1 and number 2. And like I said, please go back and refresh your memories if you are not completely sure. And to help you with that, on Show My Homework a couple of lessons ago, I think I also put it on the Dirt task, there's a whole load of knowledge organisers which we brought from the exam board, which are brilliant. And I believe that you had these topics on a page, these big knowledge organisers for when you were in year 11 studying philosophy and ethics as well. So you know exactly what to expect from them. You know that they're really, really useful. So go back and refresh by using those just quickly and have a quick little look at normative and applied ethical theories, please. So, bit of an introduction to meta-ethics. Like I said, it's concerned with the meaning of the language of ethics and how we can justify it. How can we justify the word good? What do we actually mean by the word good? How can we justify the word bad? Or how can we justify that an action is bad? Because how do we actually know what the word bad actually means? Now, meta-ethics is known as a second-order moral discourse, and that's really important, the second-order moral discourse, because it takes us behind what's going on in the normative ethics. So the normative ethics are the first-order moral discourse. It's something that we have a look at first to perhaps get this guide, this sense of what's right or wrong and how we should behave in different moral situations. But then meta-ethics looks behind that. It's the second thing that we should have a look at by really trying to figure out what we mean by good and right and wrong and bad, to try and figure out what implications that has for the normative ethical approach. So those 2 words are really, really important, second order moral discourse and first order moral discourse. So it's really important that you understand the difference between the 2. And then finally, meta-ethics is about what it means to claim that something is right or wrong and the grounds in which it does so. So how can we say that one action is always good and one action is always bad? So for example, would it be right to say that murder is always right? Wrong. It's obviously not right. Would it be right to say that murder is always wrong? Well, in most instances, yes. But what about things like self-defense? How can we apply one deontological theory of right and wrong to different situations? And how can we justify doing that when we don't perhaps always know what the word good or bad means in different situations? So, just as a bit of a breakaway task, what I would like you to do now, because these are so important, I'd like you to create your own definitions for first order moral discourse and second order moral discourse, please. So, metaethics asks these types of questions. Can we be certain about moral questions? What do we mean by saying that something is good, bad, right or wrong? Is moral language just a way of expressing our own moral preferences or emotions? So by that question, I kind of mean, if I say, oh, well, lying is bad, is that a standard moral that everyone should follow universally? Or is that just what I think? Do I personally think that lying is bad? How can we differentiate between the two? It then goes on to ask about things like, what is a moral value, and how can we get things like moral facts? Are there things such as moral facts? Are we creating our own rules or discovering rules that are somehow embedded in the world? So are these moral rules and moral right and wrongness, are they given to us, or is it part of our innate kind of understanding? Do we just know it? Is it part of our intuition? And then, do we know what is right by a process of reason, or is it simply intuition? Now, just like religious language, it was having a look at how do we know when something is meaningful? Applying that to metaethics, it's how do we know when something is good, right, bad or wrong? What I've got here for you is a really kind of good, and on the next slide I've also got another one, a really good differentiation between normative ethics and metaethics. So normative ethics is the reasons behind the decisions in the ethical decision-making process. So say, for example, I was a situationist, I would follow the situation ethics rules to justify the decisions behind an ethical choice that I'm making. And it performs a guide, or it gives me a guide to my moral behaviour. So if I were a situationist, my moral behavioural guide would be to follow agape, to follow love. Okay, because don't forget, situation ethics developed by Fletcher in the 60s was all about Jesus and agape, and how we find that the best action to do is to always follow what's right in the course of love.
Here's the top search result.
Oh, sorry about that. Metaethics is concerned with the philosophy behind the ethics. It's having a look at the words that we are using when we have a look at ethical decision-making processes, to make sure that the words that we are using are meaningful, that they are the right words, and that we actually all understand what we mean when something is good or when something is bad. Again, I found this on the internet, actually, this image, and I think it's really good to show you the similarities and the differences between the first order moral discourse and the second order moral discourse. So metaethics is kind of theoretical normative guide to behaviour. It's really rigid, it's quite deontological, because actually it's all about tautology, it's all about the definitions of the word. And once we've defined the word, you can't change that. Okay, you can't change the definition of a word without changing its entire meaning. So with metaethics, once we've figured out what we actually mean by good, bad, right and wrong, then we can't change those standards of the definition of behaviour. So it's actually quite a deontological approach to ethical decision making, but it's also more philosophical, because it's having a look at what do we mean by that thing, rather than telling you do this, do that, do this, do that. So normative ethics tells us how we should behave. Metaethics tries to have a look at, is that wording of good, bad, right or wrong and how we should behave, is the wording behind that meaningful? Is it actually correct? So there's some quite stark differences there, but there are some similarities between the two. So there are some similarities between normative ethics and metaethics. And it's all about the reasons behind decision-making processes. It's all about how we understand the different types of rights and wrongs and the certain words that we use throughout ethical decision-making processes. And it's all about understanding the different ethical concepts and situations which you can apply ethics to. So going back to our fourth slide about the 4 different ways of ethics, the similarities there are having a look at how we can apply the language of ethics, but also how we can apply the normative ethical guides to different situations that we may find ourselves in. So what I would like you to do is just kind of jot a few ideas down. Where do you think morality comes from? Now, I'm not interested in what the internet says. I'm not interested in what your parents or families or whatever say. I want to know what you think, or where do you think morality comes from? Is it just this innate, built-in sense of right and wrong that we've got? And if it is, where did we get that innate sense of right and wrong from? Do we establish the difference between right and wrong from having a look at society, having a look at how other people have behaved in history? Where do we get the ideas of morality from? Now, if you can, now you should be able to, but if you can, try and link some of these ideas back to scholars that we've already studied. And just to give you a bit of a quote here, just to give you a bit of a hint, give me the boy until he is 7 and I will show you the man. So you can also approach that hint into your answer here. So, as we've discussed, metaethics is having a look at the language behind the normative ethical theories. And there's a really significant scholar here called G.E. Moore, and he started the debate between metaethics by having a look at the difference between good things and goodness in itself. What do you think G.E. Moore actually means by this? Can you try and come up with your own analogy of something which is good, which has got goodness, and something which is a good thing? Obviously I'm going to discuss this a bit later on, but try and have a go on your own. What do you actually think Moore means here? So Moore had a look at this as a kind of, these aren't his analogies, but he was looking at this when he tried to differentiate between something which is a good thing and something which has got goodness. So a good coffee could be produced unfairly by unpaid farmers. A good knife could be used to do an act such as murder. So the word good does not always make something morally better. Can you come up with your own examples of that? And then again, just to try and embed the ideas that the word good means different things when applying it to different situations, what I would like you to do is to try and take on G.E. Moore's ideology here and the differentiation between a good thing and goodness, and try to describe what the word good means in each of these sentences. So what do I mean when I say he was a good dog, or it was a good film, or she had a good soul? What do I actually mean by the word good in those sentences? And again, can you link this to religious language? There's definitely similarities here between something that we've already done in religious language. And again, just to give you a bit of a hint so you can go back and try and make the link, I gave you an example where you had to try and work out what did the word result mean for an athlete and a scientist, etc., etc. So work these out in terms of G.E. Moore. What does the word good mean here? This is the crux of metaethics, trying to have a look at the language and whether or not the language is meaningful in terms of an ethical decision-making process. But try and then again link that to religious language. The more links we can form, the better it's going to be when we get back into the classroom, when we get back into year 13, because at the end, obviously you know you've got your AO1 and your AO2 questions, your 10 mark and your 15 mark questions, and you know, because I touched on it a few times, you've also got a 25 mark question, which is basically just cramming the 10 and the 15 mark together. But this is where you have to kind of make links between ethics, philosophy and Christianity. You have to pull all of these ideas together. So the more links you can make now as we go along through our study, the easier that big 25 marker will be. So, with everything that we've just had a look at, and with the kind of, don't forget this is just an introduction to metaethics, with everything that we've just had a look at, I want to introduce to you 3 different approaches to metaethics and 3 different ideas to try and define what we actually mean by the word good in different statements when we're having a look at moral behaviour. Now, the first is ethical naturalism. This is a cognitive theory. It's basically the idea that morality is defined in fact, so that we do have moral facts. And these moral facts we find within the natural world around us and the human world, the human nature. So in other words, we're basically having a look at society to tell us what is morally right and what's morally wrong. We have a look at the natural world around us to tell us what's morally right and what's morally wrong. So the answers to morality, the answers to what is good, can become fact by having a look at the goodness of the world around us. So quite easily we can be able to differentiate and be able to establish that killing somebody is bad because society tells us so, because that goes against societal norms. Okay, so ethical naturalism is having a look at the world around us and deducing moral facts from having a look at society and from having a look at nature. Then you have ethical non-naturalism. Now this is still a cognitive theory, and they basically link together, but instead of having a look at where we get our moral facts from, whereas in ethical naturalism we get our moral facts from the nature and the world around us, ethical non-naturalism is that we get our moral facts from somewhere else that's not nature, somewhere else that's not society. And ethical non-naturalism links to divine command theory. So in other words, we get our moral facts, we get our moral standards of what's good, right, wrong or bad, because God tells us what's good, bad, right or wrong. Okay, God has told us in the Ten Commandments, for example, that we should not kill, that we should not steal. So those are moral facts that we have been given in a non-natural way. We've been given them through God's command. And then finally, we've got ethical non-cognitivism. So this is the only non-cognitive approach to metaethics. And again, you should be quite familiar with the idea of cognitive theory and a non-cognitive theory, because again, it links quite well to religious language. But ethical non-cognitivism is the idea that we don't have to use our brains to work these things out. It's just our intuition. It's just an expression of our own wishes. So when we say things like, oh, lying is wrong, that can't be a moral standard, because I'm just expressing on you my own belief, my own intuition, that I believe that lying is wrong or theft is wrong, for example. Now, these three branches are really, really important. Just as important are the words in the brackets at the end of each definition. So these three key areas of metaethics can be split down even further into moral relativism or realism and intuitionism. Okay, so moral relativism or realism is the idea that we get morals and the idea that we get our moral judgment through real time, through kind of relative judgment, through understanding the world around us. And then ethical non-cognitivism can be split down into intuitionism, because it's an expression of what I innately and inherently believe as a person. Now, I'm not going to take it much further than that today. What I would like you to do is watch this YouTube link, and I will link this on to Show My Homework for you. This kind of goes really, really well at breaking down those three different approaches. So breaking down ethical naturalism, ethical non-naturalism and ethical cognitivism. And it breaks it down even further in a flowchart. And you all know that I love a flowchart and some arrows and boxes and diagrams and things. So it's really easy to understand. This is just an introduction, because I actually think that those three elements, breaking it down into those two smaller elements of moral relativism or realism and intuitionism, can become a little bit complicated. So I'm going to leave it there for today, and I am quite looking forward to seeing your definitions of yellow and to seeing what your different approaches of where we find morality from. So please, just like you are doing always, send me a bit of a photo of the work that you've produced. And if you do have any questions, obviously you know my email address, and I will put my email address on to Show My Homework for you anyway.